Flameland, my short, cute, colorful 2D platformer, and in today's devlog, I want to talk about the new mini-bosses. Mini-bosses have been on my wishlist for a while now. I made a video a while back about how Kirby's Adventure is successful because it varies its gameplay. It takes time to step away from the core platforming to do things like a hub world and mini-games and mini-bosses, and so it should surprise no one, since Kirby's Adventure is the main inspiration for this game, that I also wanted a hub world and mini-games, and now, finally, mini-bosses. But I don't like platforming game bosses. Now, I don't think that's a very hot take. Lots of people criticize some of the bosses from some of the most classic games, but to explain the kinds of bosses I want to make, I am going to start by telling you my hottest take. I don't like the bosses from Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Now, these bosses are beloved for a reason. They are interesting and dynamic and well crafted, but for me, a boss is just a way to vary the gameplay, a way to step away from the platforming to make it feel fresh when I get back to it. The levels are the heart of the experience, and when I get stuck on a boss and locked out of new levels, I get frustrated. The 9 health bosses of Tropical Freeze felt like long checkpointless gauntlets, and I never even bothered to beat the final boss because why would I? There were no levels that I'd unlock by beating him. So what bosses do I like? I mean, obviously the ones from Kirby's Adventure, but maybe that's just because they're so short and easy. I was much more surprised by how much I enjoyed all 4 boss fights from Kaze and the Wild Masks, even when I got stuck on them, and even the last one, which could definitely be described as a long, checkpointless gauntlet. I think there are 2 important differences between the Kaze and the Tropical Freeze bosses. One is density. Tropical Freeze bosses take 3 health per phase, whereas Kaze bosses only take 1 health per phase, and that last boss, which is long, justifies its length by having 7 phases. But the other difference, the more surprising and useful to me, is predictability. I don't just mean that you can learn a Kaze boss's cues and attack patterns. I mean there is 0 RNG whatsoever. Levels in platformers are predictable. Part of what's fun about them is the ability to memorize the path and run it more and more quickly, more and more smoothly. I think people make roguelikes because they worry that memorized layouts get stale, but learning and perfecting specific maps is a really enjoyable part of the experience for me. And when bosses play exactly the same way every time, perfecting the movement in those boss battles can feel a lot like perfecting the movement in a level. So back when I made the final boss, I had a lot of this in mind. I needed to make sure it wasn't too long. I mean, because it was the final boss, I needed it to have some length so it could feel like a satisfying climax to the run, but I divided that length into 4 shorter phases. Warm up, serious up, fastball, chase. And I made its movement totally dependent on how you move, much like some of the sections in the Kaze final boss. And I'm really happy with how this came out because I really like fighting him. And when I made these mini bosses, I had 2 goals. Short enough to be 1 phase even, and predictable, no RNG. I quickly came upon a third idea. The mini bosses could be used to further explore level gimmicks. In the underground level with seesaws and lava, you need to use the seesaw to guide Cerberus into the lava. In the wasteland, which has these mines as a minor gimmick, you have Davy Jones run into the mines. The balloon platforms of the highlands become key to guiding the unicorn into these targets, while the electric traps of the outlands are the best way to damage the Sphinx. This recontextualization of level gimmicks fits so well into Flameland's level philosophy and makes the bosses feel even more at home in the game. Hiding the mini-bosses within the levels led to another important idea. The mini-bosses are skippable. Of course they are. The levels are all about picking your path, so even if I had made them to block an exit, you would just be able to pick a different exit. But actually I decided to make them side rooms that lead nowhere but just offer an extra dragon if you beat them. If you're going for a fast run and you've kept your full roster of dragons, you can go right past them. But the next decision I made is one I'm going back and forth on, especially as it pertains to the 2nd level mini-bosses. See, I've been trying to figure out how to make the game easier to beat, and I've decided at this point that I'm not going to do the continue button that I mentioned in the last devlog, but I wanted to have an easy way for you to get more health. Health in Flameland is expressed by your characters. Each character on your team has 1 health, so the more characters on your team, the more health you have. You can only get more health by finding more characters, which is cool because the health is simultaneously a secret unlockable character for future runs and a power-up in the current run. However, some of the later health power-ups are hidden on specific routes and require certain dragon abilities to get them, which is great for the secret unlockable character component of the health, but bad for the power-up component component of the health. What I mean is, it becomes harder to get health the further you are into a run, and I want to fix that. So by contrast, I placed the mini-bosses toward the beginning of levels, before the paths branch, and I required no special abilities to find them. The level 3 ones in particular are in areas you cannot miss, so they provide an obvious risk-reward, and for players who take the time to learn the bosses, they are basically free health at the beginning of a level. However, I also mentioned that the bosses become ways for me to further explore level-specific gimmicks. Well, that can feel weird toward the beginning of a level. In the second level mini-bosses in particular, the mini-boss doors are located before those gimmicks would have been introduced, so I added these hallways before the mini-bosses to introduce the gimmicks. And I mean, the hallways turned out great actually. They give you an idea of what to expect and make the mini-boss feel more dramatic, but it still feels weird to me. Cerberus especially feels like a test of mastery over one of the main level gimmicks, and yet he's right at the start. I may end up moving the second level mini-bosses to later in the level for this reason. I'm still on the fence about it. So that was a summary of the new mini-bosses and my decisions surrounding them. Now, there is so much more that's new this time around. I basically tore apart and then rearranged and rebuilt the latter half of the woodland. I created a new bonus ring level. I created new bonus minigame levels for specific dragons. Jake made island theme music and new sound effects. There's a feature where if you hold 0, you can quickly reset a run. There are new buildings to explore. The cafe, where I put the ability to delete data and some extra information, and the bell tower, where you unlock albums for levels by finding all the exits in a level, which finally lets me reward players for finding level exits, or it will once the rest of the music is in. Oh, and small thing, but the Electric Dragon equipment has a more consistent UI and logic to it. But I decided to focus on mini-bosses today because I thought they were the most interesting recent design decision, and my next goal is probably going to be more mini-bosses, this time for the level 1s. Thanks so much for watching, and if you want to try the current build of Flameland, there will be a link in the description.